Hello, I'm Kay Walter Corellis, and I'm really excited to share the life and legacy of George Washington Champion, my grandpa, who was a nearly lifelong resident of South Park and one of the last railroaders in Como. Also excited to share his recollections of the last rotary snowplow trip through the Alpine tunnel in 1910. I'm a professional violinist and a recently retired elementary music teacher. I'm excited to share my other passion, my favorite part of Colorado history. My Grandpa George, whom I will now refer to as George, was interviewed in 1958 by the famous Mac Poor. George and Mac had become good friends through their association with the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club. Mac wrote the definitive book, The Denver, South Park, and Pacific, and interviewed and recorded George about his experience piloting the last rotary snowplow through Alpine Tunnel in 1910. George also wrote about his remembrances of growing up in South Park, which was published in the 1963 January issue of the Colorado Magazine and recently republished by Park County Historical Society. I will refer to these articles as well as other books and encourage you to read them. This presentation will mainly focus on George's life history and career in South Park. George was a true pioneering spirit, and it seemed there wasn't anything he couldn't build, make, or fix. Among George's talents was poetry. He wrote enough to fill a book, which I hope to publish yet. We began writing poems to each other at Christmas, and he gave me this framed picture with a poem on the back. To Kay from Grandpa, 1976. Here's a little present for you, an old photo of myself. You can hang it on your bedroom wall or hide it away on some shelf. It reminds me of a few pleasant days and of a grand railroad trip, of all my many railroad friends, and above all, their companionship. I'm not as young as I used to be, but I still like to ride the rail. Through the years, methods have changed. My memories of old times never fails. I was hoping you'd like this picture. I'm sorry I can't say more, so hang it up on the bedroom wall or behind the closet door. George Washington Champion was born on February 22, 1884, which was the same date as President George Washington's birthday. Thus, he took the middle name Washington because of it. A poem he wrote in 1929 was titled South Park, Colorado. White coats are seen in the distance in the towering mountain peaks. The valleys are green, the water runs clear in the many little creeks. The land where men who are good and true have struggled to blaze the way, men who have hoped and often prayed that they may sometimes see a brighter day, where the lure of gold in the early days gave courage to many a heart, to find a way over a rugged trail that leads to the old South Park. George began his Remembrances of South Park writing, South Park in Park County has an area of approximately 1,500 square miles and a view from Kenosha Pass in the summer when the meadows are green, and especially in the fall when the aspen trees are in color, is a most beautiful sight. I would also like to add, South Park is surrounded by mountains, and any way you come into the park is over a pass. Until about 1840, it was a summer destination of native tribes following vast herds of buffalo, antelope, and incredible amounts of other wildlife. Winters in South Park are legendary, and even though incredibly beautiful, they're notoriously fraught with hidden perils of snow, cold, and wind. Anyone who has been caught in a blizzard in South Park does not easily forget that experience. When a ground blizzard wipes out all frames of reference, it can rightly be called terrifying. My grandparents, George and Mame, both grew up in Como with their brothers, sisters, parents, and friends. They experienced a way of life, survived, and thrived with all the excitement and sacrifice of being part of a railroad town during the historic Colorado Railroad boom. This picture looks idyllic, but try to imagine what it would have been like to experience living in Como back in the 1880s. To start with, there was no running water, most people had to pump it, no electricity yet, no phone or internet, heating and cooking with wood stoves, and relatively thin walls in your home, where snow still blew in the cracks, digging out to an outhouse, not to mention attempting to get little narrow-gauge trains over high mountain passes and maintain tracks even in the middle of winter. Now that you are in the proper frame of mind, are you ready for an adventure? Okay, here we go. Gold was discovered in 1858 near Como in Tarryall Creek, and prospectors rushed into the area. However, it was difficult to get here, and in 1876, 2 coal deposits were discovered in South Park, and finally in 1879, the railroad arrived, and the rest was history. I have an autographed copy of the book Goin' Railroading by Sam Spees as told to his daughter Margaret Cole. It's inscribed to Kay, granddaughter of the wonderful George Champion. George contributed information and pictures to this book and several others. Margaret wrote, "The 19th century was the golden age for America's railroads, a time when almost every young boy watched the trains rumble by and dreamed of going railroading. Prospectors rushed to South Park in 1858 after gold was discovered in Tarryall Creek above Como, but before the railroads came, the trip was dangerous, expensive, and could take months." In June 1870, the first Denver Pacific passenger train rolled into Denver. After railroads reached Colorado, the trains brought the laborers from farms, villages, and cities to work in the mines and operate the smelters, and they brought the railroaders to run the trains. Thousands of people were streaming into Colorado, and at one time, 1/3 of Colorado's population was in Park County. Between 1870 and 1880, Denver's populations had jumped from 4,700 to 35,000. One newcomer wrote, "The city is full of sightseers and fortune hunters, many seeking employment, a great many more than can obtain it." Colorado became a state in 1876, the same year as the discovery of 2 coal deposits in South Park. This led to the formation in 1879 of the South Park Coal Company and the hiring of many miners, mostly Italians. A community sprang up around the southeast coal diggings called King, and another sprang up with the new station. The miners and stonemasons who were imported to build the roundhouse there named the place Como after their hometown near the beautiful Bergamo Alps in Italy, and the nearby pond, Lake Como, after Lake Como in northern Italy. Railroads built east of the mountains were standard gauge, but narrow gauge railroads needed to be built into the mountains. Narrow gauge could be laid more quickly for less cost and navigate steep grades and sharper curves better than standard grade track. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad was the first to reach central Colorado's mining districts. Then construction started up through Turkey Creek and Platte Canyons and over Kenosha into South Park. This narrow gauge line first reached Jefferson, then Como in June 1879. The Como town site was laid out by George Lechner on the old Stubbs Ranch. The line eventually went over Boreas and Fremont passes into Leadville and finally over Alpine Pass to Gunnison. Como was established as the division point, and the post office opened in July 1879. Businesses and houses sprang up almost overnight from a tent city. The railroad meant ease of travel for residents, business people, and visitors, and brought the regular arrival of newspapers and mail. Telegraph lines also came into South Park alongside the railroad tracks, providing a faster communication link to Denver and the rest of the nation. The railroad carried building material and other goods into South Park and freighted ore, cattle, and hay back to Denver. The Como Depot was the primary stop and major hub in all of Park County. George Washington Champion was born in Jefferson in 1884. His father, my great-grandfather, had the post office and the general merchandise store there, and also South Park Full Cream Cheese. He was also agent for South Park Hay Company. George wrote in his Remembrances, "I was born in 1884 at the Herman Littmer Ranch about a mile north of Jefferson." Apparently Mother, Bertha Ortman Champion from Cincinnati, was staying with the Littmers at the time. Soon after I was born, perhaps a year or two, Mother and Father moved to Denver. My first schooling was in Denver. In 1890, we moved back to Jefferson. I was a little over 6 years old at that time and went to school at Jefferson, finishing the 8th grade there. My father, George Champion Sr., born in Woolwich, England in 1855, was engaged in the mercantile business in Jefferson, having the general store and post office. The population of Jefferson was never large, but the general store, saloon, blacksmith shop, and harness shop drew a constant flow of business from the surrounding ranches whose industry was hay and cattle. Father was also agent for the South Park Hay Company. He supervised the selling and shipping. There was a large hay warehouse at the north edge of town on the leg of the railroad Y, and during the haying season and throughout most of the winter, shipments were numerous. It may surprise some to learn that there was once a cheese factory in Jefferson. It was formed by several of the ranchers, and the product was known as South Park Full Cream Cheese. Father also was agent for this company and supervised production, shipping, and finances. In January 1893, the community was shocked upon hearing of an explosion in the nearby King Coal mines that took the lives of 25 miners. Shortly after the explosion, I visited the town of King. Father sent me along with a businessman from Denver. My remembrance is that the town seemed very quiet. The mine had resumed operation, although no doubt there was still some cleanup work to be done down in the mine. A number of the miners killed in the explosion were buried in the Como Cemetery. A special train was provided by the railroad to convey the dead to Como. A large tombstone marks the grave plot and is inscribed in Italian, as there were many Italians working in the King mines. It seems like there were some pretty wild times around Jefferson in those days. There were some pretty tough customers along the ranch hands and the cowboys, for the cattle business was brisk. Some of the boys used to come to town, some would get drunk, and I've seen several times when they rode their horses right into the saloon. An occasional dance was always a drawing card, although we had no original dance hall until after the cheese factory went out of business. It was then fixed up for a community meeting place and the floor finished off for dancing. Music was furnished with whatever was available, violin, guitar, and piano most of the time. Before we had the old cheese factory for a community hall, most of our entertainment was held in the little school building. Church service was also held there once or twice a month, which was about as often as the Reverend Father Dyer could make it. Father Dyer is one of Colorado's 16 founding fathers, and this portrait resides in the dome of our state capitol building. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, Dyer labored in the camps of South Park, covering much of his large circuit on foot or, in the winter, on long Norwegian skis. For this practice, he became known as the snowshoe itinerant. George stated Mr. Dyer always stayed at our house when he came to Jefferson. We all enjoyed his short visits and liked to listen to him talk. I remember him as a very kind and pleasant man, and at that time he was getting along in years. I drove a horse and buggy to take him several times to Como or Fairplay after his short stay at Jefferson. He seemed to be continually on the move and had many thrilling experiences. His book, The Snowshoe Itinerant, is very worthwhile reading. During summer, we went horseback riding, and we would ride out to one ranch or another to watch the haying operations. I also used to spend time fishing along Jefferson Creek. In the winter, we did a lot of skating on the ice of Jefferson Creek. The ice there was always pretty good, and many times we had skating parties. Young and old turned out for these events. Most all of the ranchers and a few of the townspeople had horse-drawn sleighs or bobsled those days, and I have enjoyed many a sleigh and bobsled ride. The Snowy Peaks Are There, written in 1927, inspired by Jefferson Creek. At evening when the sun is setting over the crest of the Great Divide, at twilight when the smoke of the campfire is drifting far and wide, at night when the scent of the stately pines is fragrant with each cool breeze, at dawn when the birds are awakening and there's a sound of rustling leaves, when the mists from the valley are rising and there's a cooling crispness in the air, there's never a change in the mountain range and the snow-studded peaks are there. George recalled, I was a kid in Jefferson when the first phone came in. Dad had one for everyone, but there was terrible static sometimes. If you wanted to send a message and make sure it got there, you'd send a telegram. I used to spend quite a lot of my leisure time at the town blacksmith shop. The shop always seemed to be busy, shoeing horses mostly during the summer and repairing wagons, hay mowers, etc. during the winter. I was always fascinated watching the operations of forging and fitting of the horseshoes and watching the sparks fly from the various welding jobs. The winter of 1898 and 99 was a very severe winter, and my grandpa, George Champion, remembers that his dad, George Champion Sr., decided to move from Jefferson to Como that year and establish the Champion Gwen Mercantile with his partner, Dave Gwen. They had a butcher shop and a slaughterhouse also. The winter was so severe that trains were continuously blocked, and they often had to try to transport produce and mail over Boreas Pass with teams and bobsleds because the trains could only get about as far as Grant. In November 1898, Father decided to dispose of his interests in the store at Jefferson and go into the mercantile business in Como with my Uncle Dave Gwen as partner. So in December the same year, we moved to Como. The roads were all snow-packed, and our household goods had to be transported by teams and bobsleds. I won't easily forget that famous moving day, for it was a cold day. I was riding my horse, herding the milk cow along, and although it was only a 7-mile trip, it seemed longer before we reached Como and got the cow, the saddle horse, and the other horse and buggy put away. My younger brother Clarence and I were kept pretty busy, and it seemed like there was no end of things to be done. In Como, the Champion Gwen store maintained a butcher shop along with other business and a slaughterhouse down in the gulch below town. Most of the beef was brought from various ranches and processed at the slaughterhouse. Other meats were shipped in by railroad. The following excerpt by Isla Allen, daughter of the owner of the Allen Saloon, was taken from the Echoes of Como book. She wrote, "A few years ago when I was in Como, I walked down Main Street looking in the windows thinking of the folk who had operated the various places of business. The Champion Gwen grocery store still had the old meat block in it, and I felt that Mr. Champion, in his white apron, would surely appear from the shadows any minute with a cleaver in one hand and a cut of meat in the other. We sold our veal to them. I could almost see Mr. Gwen handing my mother a sack of candy for we kids when she paid her bill on the first of the month." Every morning, George Sr. made his rounds to take orders. In the afternoon, he pulled up on his wagon to deliver the flour, sugar, coffee, and other staple items. This picture was taken in Denver but shows the wagon that was used in Como. This picture appears in the book Bayou Salado by Virginia McConnell, from George's autographed copy. In it, George has handwritten notes throughout the book correcting any wrong or missing dates or details. In this shot, he writes, "This picture is from my negative. Freight train in the background, headed east for Denver, 1915. George recalled Como was a pretty busy town at that time. It was just a railroad town, but with railroaders, nearby ranchers, and miners from the Tarryall district, the mercantile business seemed to thrive. I started to school soon after our move to Como and had to review 8th grade work that term. The following 2 years, I made it through the 9th and 10th grades. In this Como school picture of upper grades, George is in the front row, second from the right. Como's one-room schoolhouse is now the Como Civic Center. Back then, it was separated in the middle by a big coal stove. On one side were the first 4 grades, and on the other side were grades 5 through 8 until the high school building was brought in. Both George and my grandma Mame Delaney are in this 1893 photo. George's youngest sister Florence, the pouty one in the middle of the first row, said that in winter wearing long woolen stockings, if you sat too close to the stove, you were burning up, and if you sat too far away, you were still freezing. Mame Delaney is also in this picture in the back row, second from the right, without a hat. George recalled the winter of 1898 and 99 was very severe. The railroad was repeatedly being blocked with snow, and at one time was completely shut down for a period of about 75 days, from early February to about the middle of April. The railroad shops were almost completely shut down for several weeks, only a few men retained to keep stationary boilers going, and various equipment inside the shop from freezing. Merchandise and mail for Como, Breckenridge, and Dillon were transported by teams and bobsleds from Grant, which seemed to be about as far as the trains from Denver could get. Convoys of teams and bobsleds worked back and forth over Boreas Pass, carrying produce and mail. I distinctly remember one convoy on its return trip from Breckenridge carrying a few passengers. They had had some trouble on the pass, probably caused by drifted snow. One of the passengers got impatient and wanted to get to Como, and although the crew of the convoy protested, he set out on foot to walk to Como. A day or two later, he was found along the trail frozen to death. I remember viewing the canvas-wrapped body in the bed of a bobsled when the convoy arrived at the livery stable in Como. This was surely a really tough winter, although residents of Como did not suffer to any extent that I remember. Supplies were rationed somewhat. Everyone seemed to carry on and try to make the best of things. I remember a couple of issues of the Como newspaper, the Como Record, coming out printed on the back of some wallpaper that was available, this for lack of newsprint paper. Everyone seemed to take it as quite a joke. The snow really piled up around Como that winter, and coasting, skating, and skiing were excellent. We were able to coast on our sleds from the immediate vicinity of the schoolhouse for nearly half a mile, down through town and across the railroad tracks and as far as the bottom of the gulch below town. We were finally forbidden to coast that far during school hours, as some of us were frequently late getting back to school. In this picture, you can see 2 engines and the rotary snowplow at work. Como Lake provided good ice skating most of the winter, as the snow was usually blown off, and a small pond down in the gulch below the railroad hotel offered a skating place that was used by many. Skiing down the mountain towards Como Lake was quite a thrill. We all made our skis of any material we could find that was suitable, for it was impossible to purchase any ready-made skis. George recalled things got pretty bad in the silver panic of '93. Seems like money was scarce everywhere. The ranchers couldn't command enough cash to get the hay crop harvested, and people weren't buying much. To make ends meet, I helped out by waiting on tables while Mother took in boarders. We had mostly hay hands and railroad repair gangs. When there was trouble on the railroad, they issued script instead of paying dollars. It was pretty tough for a few weeks. During the summer months when I was not at school, I was often called upon to help in printing the newspaper, the Como Record. I also worked at the store, sometimes assisting at driving in the beef with the saddle horses, also the butchering at the slaughterhouse. Note the ad for the Gwynn and Champion groceries at the top right. Mame Delaney was born in 1884, the same year as my grandpa, George Champion. They were classmates here at the schoolhouse in Como, and later to become the Como Civic Center. Her dad, James Delaney, had one of the saloons in Como, the Turf Exchange Saloon. Their residence on 5th and Broadway had some amazing views of the trains coming in and out of Como. She later was to become my grandma. Mame Delaney, young girl on the right, was born in December 1884, the same year George was born. George and Mame were classmates and went to school together in the Como schoolhouse. Mame would later become my grandma. Mame had 2 younger brothers, Jim and Joe Delaney. A third brother, Francis, died when he was just 3 and is also buried in the Como cemetery. Mame was born in the Delaney home located on 5th and Broadway. This home had a great view of the trains coming in and out of the Como yards and overlooked the hotel. You can see a 3-engine freight extra from Denver leaving Como yards in this 1915 photo. Mame's parents were Annie Coleman from Wisconsin and James Delaney from Ohio. In Como, James Delaney was owner and proprietor of the Turf Exchange Saloon. In another excerpt from The Echoes of Como, Isla Allen writes, "In these days, Como was a boisterous town. Money was spent freely and saloons were always crowded on payday. I remember so well one day when my father delivered coal and wood to the Delaney saloon and Mr. Delaney opened the door and invited him in. I was not about to miss anything, so I slipped in too. Mr. Delaney poured my father a drink, then looked at me, apparently wondering what he could offer a 12-year-old girl. He and my father were soon chatting away." Mr. Delaney was a large, pleasant man, and while they talked, I was absorbed in the beauty of the place, so different than I had imagined a saloon to be. The huge potbelly stove was highly polished, as was the long, shining bar, backed up with an enormous, sparkling mirror. The wood floor and several paneled doors were also polished to a high gloss, and with Mr. Delaney so friendly and hospitable, it was for me a delightful experience. My mother, however, took a dim view of my father's, allowing me inside a saloon. One day, Annie Delaney suffered an accident. She had been rendering lard on the stove, and it caught fire, causing her severe burns. She never fully recovered from the burns and died in April 1901 at the age of 50. Mame was just 16 with her two younger brothers, Jim and Joe, at the time of her mother's passing. On Wednesday, April 24th, 1901, the funeral of Miss James Delaney took place. An immense crowd attended the funeral, and the church was filled to its utmost capacity, with many forced to remain standing outside. The casket was decorated with an exquisite profusion of flowers, showing how highly esteemed the deceased was among the people of Park County. Mrs. Delaney is buried in the Como Cemetery, the beginning of a family plot. There are many more inscriptions on various other headstones in the Como Cemetery, and one fact is clearly evident: many of these people died very young. The roundhouse was built in 1881 by Italian stonemasons who named the town after beautiful Lake Como in Italy. My grandpa George Champion started his apprenticeship as a machinist in the roundhouse in September of 1901 for 5 cents a day for a 10-hour day and for a 4-year apprenticeship. He worked at firing engines, calling engine crews, and also worked master mechanic's office. In this photo, George is second from the left. George recalled, after finishing the 10th grade in 1901, Father finally asked me if I wanted to go to Denver to school or keep working. I had made up my mind to go railroading, so I told him what I had in mind. He said he would see what he could do about getting me work in the railroad shop, as he did not approve of the idea of me going out on the road. He eventually made arrangements with the master mechanic at the shop for me to start work as a machinist's apprentice. Hence, on September 1st, 1901, I started work in the railroad shops. Ever since moving to Como, the railroad, engines, etc. fascinated me, and I spent a great deal of my spare time around the engines and shops. I was sure thrilled with the opportunity to go railroading, even though it was in the shops. A few years later, I had the opportunity to go out on the road. The Como Roundhouse, originally built in 1881, included 12 stalls and a machine shop in a wooden section, in addition to the 6-stall stone section. The wooden stalls were torn down in 1919. 3 stalls were rebuilt but burned along with the machine shop in 1935. The 6-stall stone roundhouse still remains, complete with its new turntable. We hope you will come visit it on Como Open House days. In this picture of the shop crew at Como, George is second from the left in the front row. Also, note the rotary snowplow in the back right. George recalled, in 1901, I was 17 years of age and was supposed to serve 4 years apprenticeship. That seemed like a long time at the start, but the years soon slipped away. Wages were nothing to brag about in those days. I was paid 5 cents an hour for a 10-hour day the first year. After the first year, I received 2.5 cents per hour raise every 6 months, with the exception of the 4th year, and then 17.5 cents an hour for the full year until my apprenticeship was completed. Even full-fledged machinists were not paid very high wages at that time. Top wages were 30 cents per hour. During my apprenticeship, I was very fortunate in having the opportunity to work at various other jobs besides the machine and erecting work that was done in the main shop. I was often called upon to fire up engines, call engine crews, also various other jobs, and sometimes I worked as a clerk in the master mechanic's office. On my time off on Sundays or holidays, I often rode a helper engine to Boreas and return, or perhaps to Kenosha and return, and in doing so, I had the opportunity to learn how to fire an engine on the road and how to run one. This picture is of the rotary at work east of Baker Tank. Most of the engine men were fine fellows and were always willing to show and explain things to me. I sure enjoyed these trips, and sometimes I would take a helper trip in the evening after regular working hours at the shop. George recalled that in his day at the shops, the railroad employed something like 60 to 70 men, and that the number may have even reached 100. Payroll in Como at its peak would be about 150 persons. One section of the wooden portion of the Como Roundhouse contained the carpenter shop, where doors and windows of engine cabs were repaired. Engine tanks and tracks were repaired and rebuilt in other parts of the circular building. The machine shop jobs and engine erecting work were done in the stone portion of the shop. Another small portion called the paint shop was an area where paint, varnish, and supplies were stored. This picture was of the Como machine shop in 1902 with Jim Delaney, Mame's brother, Phil Duffy, and Max Dunbar. George recalled that engine overhaul consisted of completely dismantling of the engine's working parts, air brake equipment, running gear, driving rods, and link motion, while most all fixtures were removed and overhauled. Cylinders were rebored and refitted with new piston heads. Driving wheels were turned or trued up on the big wheel lathes. In most cases, new boiler flues were installed, and at times, new grates and ash pans replaced the old. A new paint job culminated the overhaul. Railroad cars and coaches were not serviced or painted at Como, just the locomotives received the attention of the shop crew. Como at its peak had a population of about 500, with about as many as 20 to 26 trains coming in and out every day. Each train had its own distinct whistle, and the sound of that, plus all the businesses in town, must have made this a very exciting place to be. Isla Allen wrote another excerpt from the Echoes of Como book. To me, the train whistles were very thrilling, especially at night, as well as sounds of engines putting coal up into the coal chutes. George recalled there were 2 general stores, a bakery, a shoe shop, 2 Chinese laundries, a clothing store, and a post office. A drugstore, 2 restaurants, 2 rooming houses, a printing office, and the railroad hotel and depot. There were 3 saloons and at one time 4, a pool hall, a livery and feed stable. Also a railroad library and barber shop. Mrs. Josephine Kelly was proprietor of a 2-story brick rooming house. She came from Sweden, was an accomplished violinist, and, with Mame Delaney at the piano, provided much enjoyment for Comoites at the new town hall where dances were held. Suppers were delicious. Huge pans of sandwiches, potato salad, and all kinds of fancy cakes and coffee. The Como Band were fine performers for their townspeople, appearing at the railroad depot on occasions that needed a send-off or a welcome home. Jim Delaney was the band leader, on the left with the trumpet, and in the back left was Joe Delaney on trombone. They were Mame's brothers and my great-uncles. In this 1908 Como Band photo, notice the insignia on the drum, which Pat Morrow helped me recreate for our current Railroad Day exhibit and Denver Brass concerts. George left Como in 1904 to work for another railroad, but came back again in 1908 to work again at the old narrow gauge shops. He'd worked for a while in Nebraska, where his first daughter Dorothy was born. He recalled that some of the shop crew had already gone by that time, and the workforce was much different. In this picture, George is on the very left, in the back. George recalled, after completing my apprenticeship in the fall of 1904, I decided to leave Como and seek employment on another railroad, but I returned to Como in 1908 to work again in the old narrow gauge shop. In the meantime, I had married one of my old schoolmates, Mame Delaney, in Como on December 31st, 1906, when I was 22. This picture is from their 50th wedding anniversary. The first house on the left is where George and Mame were renting in Como when they moved back in 1908. The second house was Bertha and George Champion Sr.'s house, and the large house in the middle was the residence of the Superintendent of Railroad in Como. This house, called the Spees House, where George and Mame were renting, was where their second child, George Champion Jr., was born. Notice the continuous winter difficulties. George worked briefly in Nebraska as a machinist and engine house foreman, where their first child, Dorothy, was born in 1907. This picture is of George Champion Jr. and Dorothy in Denver. George recalled, when I returned to Como in 1908, I could notice quite a change in the operation of the railroad at the time, also in the management of the railroad shops. The traffic of the railroad had fallen off considerable, and in about another year, repair work in the shop had been curtailed. Quite a number of the old employees that I had previously known had gone, and the working force was rather small compared to what it had been. George was interviewed by the famous Mac Poor back in 1958 of his recollections of going through the Alpine tunnel in 1910 with the last rotary snowplow, in which he was called as pilot. They left Como in December 31st, and it took 5 days. They had some harrowing experiences, including reviving their firemen through the tunnel, and also on the way back meeting up with a herd of cattle in one of the big snowdrifts. Quite a few of the engine men had also left the road, and the company was a little short of engine crews. I was called a number of times to make trips of the road firing. The last trip I made, I was called as pilot for the rotary snowplow on December 31st, 1909. This trip was to Pitkin through Alpine Tunnel, and it was about a week before I got back to Como. Check in our description for a link to the YouTube recording I mentioned previously. George recalled December 1909 was a pretty tough winter for railroading. Lots of snow and wind on both Boreas and Alpine passes, as well as other sections of the road, and were repeatedly being blocked with snow, and operations of trains was a difficult problem. The snowplow was in use a lot that winter, first on one division and then the other. On the morning of December 31st, I was called for one of the snowplow crew, and I was to go on the Gunnison Division to open the road between Como and Pitkin, leaving about 11:30 a.m.
My duties as pilot were to keep constant watch on the track ahead, to reverse the snow hood when the occasion required.
Well, that hood, that's the thing that throws the snow to the right or left.
Yeah, that's right. When they reverse the wheel, you have to reverse the snow hood to throw the snow accordingly, see?
Oh, I see.
And to make myself generally useful, oiling and so forth, I could signal the engineer by means of a bell cord that ran to the bell in the cab over the engineer's head, if, while working, anything went wrong.
That bell cord led back to the auger of the first engine, huh?
No, that bell cord led back to the engineer on the plow only.
Oh.
It was situated right over his head where he could hear it easy.
Well, I suppose you wanted to stop the plow right quick. How did you let the engineers behind with the regular locomotives know?
Well, I also had a whistle cord and an emergency air valve, handy for use as needed.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Well, we left Como on time with 3 engines and a combination coach on the rear end of the track for the train crew. The engineers on the engines were Johnny Olson, Billy Kearns, and Mike O'Hara.
I especially remember the snow between Fisher and St. Elmo. We were bucking pretty heavy snow drifts and throwing the snow off to the right. Occasionally, the snow from the plow would start a miniature snowslide down the steep side of the mountain. There wasn't much timber, and you could see some of those small snowslides go almost to the bottom of the canyon. It was a very impressive sight for me, and a new experience also, for it was my first trip on a rotary snowplow. George recalled the old plow didn't steam too well, and we made several stops to blow up and get up steam. We were working pretty hard constantly all the way to Alpine Tunnel. When the plow was working hard, she was sure a wicked piece of machinery. When she was working in deep snow, she would dance and vibrate, and the whole plow would shake. It was sometimes difficult to stand up. I didn't have any seat up in the pilot house. I had to stand up all the time, unless we were someplace where I could sit in the back of the seat box in the back of the cab. The Alpine Tunnel was the first tunnel built through the Continental Divide in Colorado and was the highest railroad tunnel in the world at 11,523 feet. Construction was meant to only last 6 months, but it dragged out for 18 months. They started construction from both sides and anticipated mostly granite, but most of the interior was boulders and loose slide rock. Thus, they had to order and ship hundreds of 12 by 12 foot beams of California redwood to line the tunnel. It was estimated that as many as 10,000 men worked on the tunnel, many quitting work after only a month due to the altitude and extreme conditions. When both sides finally punched through in 1881, they were only less than an inch apart. The tunnel had no ventilation except for wind blowing, and its width and height was just barely enough for a narrow-gauge train to fit through. George recalled when the train finally arrived at east portal of Alpine Tunnel, it was about 10:30 p.m. and completely dark.
It was getting late, and everybody was getting tired and hungry, and engineer and conductor, after talking things over, they decided to lead the plow through the tunnel rather than take off the side extensions of the plow hood.
Yeah.
So we tied a long piece of bell cord to the whistle cord up in the plow and started through the tunnel. Several of us walking ahead of the plow to watch closely so that if the side of the plow hood didn't clear, we could whistle the train down. It was slow going and a ticklish job with only lantern light to see by, and to make things worse, the gas and smoke from the engines and plow was getting pretty bad. Only once did I whistle them down, as we came to a place in the tunnel where it looked like the plow might not clear. It was a good thing we stopped when we did, for someone, I don't remember just who, found our fireman, Johnny Halleck, down in the deck of the plow, overcome by gas.
Huh.
Some of the boys got him off the plow and down on the floor of the tunnel, revived him and took him back to the coach out of the dense gas.
George recalled we finally got a whistle signal from the rear engine to go ahead, so we finished leading the plow on through the tunnel and all climbed aboard and drifted down to Alpine Station where we tied up for the night. It had taken about an hour to get through the tunnel, almost 1,800 feet, stopping as we did for the firemen and so forth. It was close to midnight when we tied up and got something to eat, the first meal we'd had since morning. George recalled after eating and making arrangements for a bed, I went over to the telegraph office and sent a telegraph to my mother and dad in Denver and wished them Happy New Year, for it was January 1st, 1910. Most all of us slept upstairs that night except for the trainsmen. I think they slept in the coaches. Close to noon, we left Alpine. From Alpine to Pitkin was a rather slow trip. We bucked out the cut and some small slides below the Palisades, took water at Woodstock Tank, and finally pulled into Pitkin about 6 o'clock. The Palisades are a series of rock walls built on the west side of the tunnel, which is actually along a cliff. The rock walls had to be built to support the train and are famous for the fact that they're made out of precisely cut blocks of granite and put together with no mortar. The engines and plow were taken care of by the night watchman, so we all made our way to the main part of town for accommodations. Walking through deep drifts to the restaurant, we came upon one of the firemen from an eastbound freight who had taken on too many Tom and Jerry's, and he'd wandered off the trail and was down in the deep snow. We helped him up and helped him into the boarding house and to bed. Another fierce storm forced a 3-day layover in Pitkin, and they held us there since they wanted the plow to open up the pass again after the storm. Finally, the train and rotary plow were ready for the return trip to Como. It was January 4th, 1910, at about 7 a.m. when we pulled out of Pitkin. The snow had really piled up in places. Engineer Annis had warned me to immediately stop the train if any rocks were found in the deep cuts. The snow was higher than the top of the rotary. We had a crew of section men that were instructed to shovel out the high snow so we could back out of the cut. We had to do this several times. We were making good progress. Suddenly I heard the rotary wheel hit something solid, so I whistled them down and we backed out of the cut. A traveling engineer climbed up and questioned why we had stopped. The traveling engineer grabbed the cord and whistled them on ahead, but indeed there were rocks and they tore off most of the knives on the rotary blades. Many of them were torn off and went out the snow chute and down the mountainside. We had to drag big rocks out of the way and repairs had to be made. It took most of the afternoon. When I told Engineer Annis what and how things had happened, he said if he had been warned in time, no doubt all could have been avoided. He also said we'd probably have to make out a report when we got to Como. George recalled we went on through the tunnel and on to the east side. Again, it was a very slow trip through the tunnel, and I was sure glad we made it without mishap to St. Elmo. In the morning, it was about 10 a.m. when we left St. Elmo, and we ran into another deep cut. When he felt the plow slow, Annis widened the throttle, but this time we had met up with a herd of cattle that had taken shelter from the wind and snow. Engineer Annis whistled the train down, though by that time we had made sausage out of some of the cattle and crippled many more. One of the crew was sent to destroy the cattle that were hurt, but he was soon back up on the plow, chased by one of the crippled cows. Back at Como about 10:40 at night, and at the end of a thrilling journey, the plow was left at the roundhouse to be repaired. As described by George, the front of the rotary was sure a mess. Broken, bent bolts and blades were filled with hides and various other parts of chopped up beef, all of which made it somewhat unpleasant for the machinists making repairs. I was called to the master mechanic's office to make a statement to how it all happened and also to explain how the rotary wheel was damaged. I was never questioned again, and never did I see the traveling engineer again. This was my last trip on a narrow gauge and the last trip of the rotary through the Alpine tunnel. It was an exciting trip, and as railroading goes, a great experience and one I'll always remember. After this trip, I decided I could do better elsewhere, so I left Como and moved to Denver and obtained employment on another railroad in January 1910. The Alpine Tunnel was closed in October of that year due to a cave-in, and the main line into Gunnison was abandoned. It was the beginning of the end for Como. By January 1912, only 12 families stayed on at Como, and only one storekeeper toughed it out. The last train came through Como on April 11, 1937, and the rails were scrapped out in the summer of 1938, bringing to a melancholy conclusion one of the most colorful operations in all of railroading history. George left Como in 1910, and he eventually gained some land up on the Terrial and built a cabin up there, complete with water wheel. He eventually inherited the Delaney property, which burned, unfortunately, in 1949, and built the current cabin, the Champion Cabin, in 1950. After George and Mame moved to Denver, sadly, they lost a baby girl in infancy in 1921. Joyfully, however, my mother Elaine was born in 1926. She was their youngest child, much younger than her siblings, so almost like a second family by then. In the meantime, George acquired some Forest Service land up on the Terrial above Como, which is now the Selkirk Campground, and built a cabin there. My mother recalled he researched, built, and assembled a complete water wheel in their basement in Denver and proceeded to haul it up to the cabin site to use for mining operations. The Forest Service required so much assessment or mining work in order to claim the land. The water wheel was used in conjunction with a sluice box for his mining operations and was attached to a generator located in the shed right next to it. The generator produced electricity for the cabin. My mother remembered if the stream didn't have much water in it, the lights in the cabin would be rather dim. The family used to go to the cabin every weekend in the summer from Denver, leaving promptly after work on Friday and returning home precisely at 6 p.m. on Sundays. Driving on the old dirt road, which is now Highway 285, used to take about 3 hours one way to get there. Apparently they had many family and friends as guests. George, my mother Elaine, and Mame are on the left. George sold the Terrial cabin and equipment to a friend of his who unfortunately did not keep up the assessment work, and so the Forest Service eventually took over the land. After moving to Denver, George worked for the Denver and Salt Lake Railway Company as a machinist and electrician until 1917. From then till 1932, he worked for a garage business as a service mechanic for himself and another company. Then, for 9 months, he listed his employment as no employment, for it was the Great Depression. Luckily, he did obtain work from 1933 through 41 as a foreman and shop superintendent for the U.S. Forest Service in Wyoming, Oklahoma, Colorado, and South Dakota. Unfortunately, the work necessitated him to be out of town, and my mother remembers that she and my grandma moved to the basement of their house in Denver so they could rent out the top part to boarders to help make ends meet. George would send money and letters back home. Then from 1941 to 49, he worked as a machinist for 2 different shops in Denver and retired in 1949. Eventually, George was destined to return to Como in South Park. In 1949, the old Delaney residence in Como was destroyed by fire. It was March, and the house next door had a chimney fire, and there was a fierce wind. My great-uncle Joe and Gertrude Delaney were not occupying it at the time as they were renting in Denver, but they still had all their possessions up there. They got the call in the middle of the night, but by the time they got to Como, the house had burned to the ground. Several years later, the vacant lot was given to George and he decided to build a summer cabin on it. Mac Poor bought 2 lots in Como nearby and also built a cabin. Situated next to each other, a joke came about regarding the names. George's cabin was and still is called the Champion Cabin, and Mac's cabin was called the Poor House. George built Mac's kitchen cabinets in addition to his own and some furniture. In return, Mac installed a special custom telephone line between the cabins and bunkhouse with original old wooden crank-style phones. They named it the Haywire Telephone Company. George was at one time the honorary mayor of Como, and he also helped out the Forest Service as an official fire warden. December 17, 1950 was the occasion of the wedding of my parents, Elaine and Don Lichtenwalter in Denver, and the couple on your left are Mame and George Champion. They both would have been 66 years old. Another venture of George in his retirement was helping establish Old South Park City in Fairplay. George helped furnish and set up the telegraph office in the depot building. He donated equipment, a clock, and many nice pictures for the display. However, unfortunately, before they started putting up glass in the displays to protect artifacts, many of his donations were stolen. Finishing off his remembrances in 1963, George said, "Como is more or less a ghost town now, but I still love it and enjoy spending the summers where I can look across the Old South Park." I have many of my own wonderful recollections of George and Como. When we would go visit in summer, we had the greatest adventures, plus there was always a constant flow of friends stopping in to the cabin to visit George. I learned something new every time I heard him reminisce. This picture is of my dad, mother, me, and George on one of many thrilling Jeep rides in South Park. George died when he was 98, but still spent the summers up in Como, enjoying his cabin, chopping wood, cooking on the wood stove, and driving his Jeep. He was also a wonderful poet and wrote many poems describing his childhood and growing up in South Park and all his adventures on the railroad. A poem that encapsulates some of our best time together. Invitation to Kay from Grandpa Champion. I'd like to have you go with me on a trip sometime to the hills, to see the trees and mountains all dressed up in their summer frills, to roam for a day along some stream that runs swift and pure and clear, and to see the things that I have loved and since boyhood have cherished so dear. Away up near the high mountain range that is called the Great Divide, where the snow-capped peaks stand sentinel to guard the valley far and wide. Where cool breezes fan the tall evergreens and rustle the aspen leaves, where wildflowers bloom in splendor in the shade of stately trees. Come go with me, if but for a day, away from the maddening throng, away from the city's bustling crowd, away from their laughter and song. Let's follow a trail some early morn before the sun's too high, a trail that leads to God's great country and land with clear blue sky. So put on your old hiking breeches, don't matter much about the looks, and we'll take a trip to the promised land like you've read of in storybooks. George died on April 23, 1982 at the age of 98 and is buried next to Mame and daughter Dorothy in the Como Cemetery. The year before he died, he still spent the summer at the cabin he built in Como, chopping wood, cooking meals on a wood stove, and driving his Jeep. In his obituary, it was said that the narrow gauge railroad was built along steel rails by men of iron, and his passing marked one of the most durable. In closing, here's a fitting poem George wrote in 1958 with the picture he took at sunrise. Sunrise over the old Como yards, the night crew would be gone to rest. It's rather a ghostly picture now, though I remember it at its best. Memories of little old engines ready for the morning freights, one for the east at 7:30, the other for the west at 8. Train crews bustling around the yards and engine men oiling around. Weather didn't seem to matter much, even though there's snow on the ground. Memories of whistles sounding off as they pull out on the main. Billows of smoke in the rising sun's rays made a picture not seen again. A recent picture I took from Como